G'day, thanks for joining me here tonight. Alright, so we're going to be, thanks for joining me here tonight. In the spirit of experimenting with formats, with live coding, one of the things I've been doing is pairing, and I thought, well, I've got a conference coming up very soon. It's in a month's time. I've got tons of time to write it, practice it. Why not do it together? A lot of people want to get involved with public speaking, but no one really ever shows behind the scenes. So this is a bit of an experiment. It's quite late at night. Come with me and let's build a talk together. Alright, so the talk is open source maintainers are jerks. It's a bit of a lie. Open source maintainers aren't jerks. We just care about software quite a lot. So this is the abstract. We've got a month to build the talk, and yeah, open source maintainers are jerks. So as software developers, we often make use of open source software, but rarely do we ever think about all the man hours involved in developing or supporting the project. When open source breaks, or we need new features, we log an issue on GitHub. We see it all the time. People use the language log a ticket, right? And just sit back waiting for a response. And after a week or so waiting for a response to the ticket or the GitHub issue, developers or consumers start complaining, right, about how badly the projects run. And that's just so weird. That is just so broken. Open source software, and we always forget this as maintainers and also as consumers and also as businesses that use open source software, it's as is. Like, the license says you get software as is. Like, I don't have to support you as an open source maintainer. You don't have to use the software as a software developer, and your company doesn't even need to use open source software. That responsibility falls upon yourself as a consumer of the application. So it always gets people's heckles up when you talk about open source and they focus too much on the consumption side. So that's the basis for the talk, and we're going to be fleshing out and pulling apart this abstract and turning it into something that's applicable for an audience of C-level-ish. There's way too much content for an open source community leader in this. I hope through interaction in the stream, we can, if you've got questions, I can do that now, right? I can go through some of the things I've learned with automating open source communities, some patterns, some anti-patterns, but the audience for this talk is essentially it's for business. And we want to highlight the cost of failure in an open source project. When you take a dependency on open source software, and if you don't support the supply chain, and as open source maintainer, if you choose to use the software I maintain or any other open source software out there, we're essentially a vendor, right? We're an unpaid vendor, and there's no contractual obligations. And if there's not respect, we run into problems, right? You have open source maintainers that burn out. You have security issues that don't get patched. And it was really brought to attention, a highlight a couple of years back with Heartbleed. And with Heartbleed, essentially it was the people who maintained OpenSSL. It's only like 2 people volunteer. The entire world built upon them. Like everything from SSH libraries all the way to like NetApp storage arrays. Like you name it, the entire world is built on this software. And it's as is. And when the magnifying glass came around to actually figure out the root cause of the problem, it identified, like through financial donations and contributions to the project, they were able to get leads for people who will pay for their freelancing for the maintainers to freelance on the project. But there was a catch. Those leads were to develop new features. No one was paying for the maintenance and doing the dirty work of having to refactor the source code. Huge issue. And then they looked at the donations, and they found they only had a couple $1,000s of donations. And here is something that's something that's got billions of dollars of economic value to it, and it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to patch. Something is broken or wrong in open source software, and that is the basis of this talk, is to reintroduce business executives to this notion that an open source project is a vendor, it's unpaid. Here's some ideas how you can do to secure your supply chain. So I had a question come in. Hey Shifty, thanks for tuning in. So the 3 things, we're going to be working backwards. I have figured out the 3 things that I want for a takeaway of the talk. We're going to start working backwards and then going all the way up to the front. There'll be no PowerPoint at all during this talk. It's all going to be done in Markdown. So if you have suggestions, mate, I know you've been in open source longer than I have as a maintainer. I've been a consumer for what, 18 years, and I got last 8 years, like 5, 6, was it? Yeah, like last 8 years, I got heavily involved in becoming a producer, and then like 5, 6 years is as a maintainer. If you have perspective you want to add to this, mate, all ears. The idea of this stream is let's build a conference talk together. I'll drop in the pad and you can jump in. So up in chat there is a pad, and if you click on that link you'll be able to jump into the work pad that I'm working with. Yeah, good morning. What time is in Nova Scotia? It must be like 7 AM or 6 AM? Alright, so the base of this talk is actually going to be quite interesting. It's the first time I've ever delivered a talk as a partner, as a pair. So I'm delivering this talk from a persona of a hobbyist, and my partner, Nick, runs a company called Built to Roam. And I maintain Reactive UI, and Nick maintains MVVM Cross. So there's going to be 2 different personas representing two different voices. So we've got to figure out the flow. So it's going to be quite a lot of practice needed. And I'm going to be dropping into Nick tomorrow morning and just finishing off the rest of this talk. But he's supplied some notes. So it's going to take me a little bit to unpack the abstract. In the meantime, while I do this, we'll run you through some material and just a preview of what the material is. So I've got a bunch of notes written down, and also in my head I've been thinking about this for like 3 months now. This is essentially me dumping my brain down. And let's go through a couple of things here. So Mike Quaid of the Homebrew Project had a very interesting point, and it's true. A lot of the times in open source software, people can consider themselves to be the customer. If you log an issue on GitHub, the developer that's experiencing the issue, they consider themselves to be the customer. That's wrong. In essence, you're the customer of the maintainer, right? If you want me to help you, you better like put some time in, put some time into the effort. You got to be polite. You got to actually, because you're competing against Netflix. Like, I could either watch Netflix or maintain the software and work on your unit of work. So if you're dropping out of the middle of nowhere and you haven't introduced yourself, you don't have good bedside manner or tableside manner, and you don't give me a compelling reason to help you, then it's totally okay if I don't help you. So it's not just this tweet, but there's actually a whole bunch of a blog post by Mike that was like top notch on this topic. Alright, so I've got a very basic structure that needs to be fleshed out. I'll come back to it in a couple moments. While we go for that, just to collect my thoughts, what's really important is, as maintainers, you should always be thinking about succession of your project. The natural outcome of any open source project that doesn't get new people joining the project and helping out is death. That is the outcome of open source. If it's not growing in the sense of replacing its maintainers or new contributors joining. Now, there's a lot of value put on contributing to open source, but maintainers themselves, there is a non-zero cost to review open source pull requests. And if you get it wrong, that there's a penalty. If you merge in a unit of work that's bad, you're going to get 3 or 4, depends on your scale of your project, you're going to get anything from 3 or 4 issues, or up to thousands or hundreds of thousands of issues or reports, and people will be quite upset that you break them. There is a non-zero cost to maintaining and reviewing pull requests. So a lot of people talk about contributing to open source. I think we need to have more talk about the maintainers. But there is a very distinct line here, right? Maintainers, be humble. Do not enable abuse or be an abuser. So, here's a talk that was delivered at LinuxConf AU in January. Beautiful talk called Burning Down the Castle. And it's a critical analysis of the Linux kernel development community and the problems that are faced in the Linux kernel development community. Rather than go too much into specifics, I recommend you watch it. It's on point. At the actual presentation, there was so many current Linux kernel maintainers and ex-maintainers just nodding their heads, right, in this. It was a beautiful talk. Dan's done a great job. There is problems of abuse in some open source communities. And you'll find the link for that talk up there. And one thing Dan has done very, very well, he's actually, that talk was done on it was a very emotional talk. It was about emotion. But you also need to, when trying to make a point, play to emotion, but also have data. And this was all about data. He actually did a follow-up blog post creating data that there is a problem of abuse in the community. They're losing maintainers. People are contributing and stuff's not getting merged in. Beautiful blog post, dump that in chat as well. Highly recommend that you follow Dan and watch what he's doing in the community. If you're an open source maintainer, my recommendations for guidelines is to read and devour anything by Jono Bacon. He has a book called The Art of Community, and it is a beautiful book. If you're running open source community, you should know that book back to back. So many nuggets of gold. If you've got a problem in your community, crack it open, read it, reflect, and just debug. Anyway, so that was some data on the effects of abuse in the Linux kernel maintainer community. And something that was pointed out by Paul Betts is it actually is very bananas that the only production operating system kernel built with modern software development practices, i.e. pull requests and CI, is Windows. All the other operating systems out there are based on mailing lists and merging patches in manually, and a contributor has to beg a maintainer to review and merge the work. And if the maintainer doesn't review and merge the work in time, they'll ask him to redo the patch. Like, that is not a good workflow. You're not going to get people joining community if you're doing that. Like, only reason people do that type of workflow is because they're forced to. And yeah, in that community, they're doing a whole bunch of YOLO self-merges. Right? There's minimal governance, minimal review, but a lot of responsibility. Very easy to make a mistake, and when mistakes happen, it's very, very expensive from a social capital perspective. So, one thing you can do is don't be an abuser, and don't tolerate abuse. Be a leader. So here's an example of some of the work that Dan's been doing. This popped up on Twitter a couple of days ago. And look at this. One of the things Dan's done in the Linux community is he's implemented CI. And he actually has modern CI practices where you submit a pull request. It's not necessarily a GitHub-based flow, but the idea is you raise a pull request and it tests your unit of work against master. Like, ingenious, novel, right? That doesn't exist in the Linux kernel maintainer community. And here is data saying that the work he's doing is valuable. Amazing, right? Here's someone who's able to work in that subsystem with potentially not much knowledge and huge safety belt or a confidence level that it's going to work. So, props, Dan. And this is John O'Bacon's website, the Arda Community Online. The PDF is available, but it's also available as a hard copy, and this is the book. Amazing book. Please read it. Welcome back. Just taking a pause here. So one of the sections is going to be time or money. And in essence, the way you can help an open source project is either with time or money? So let's unpack that a little bit. Money. One of the things that's been absolutely beautiful to watch over the last 8 months is other open source projects other than Reactive UI, other projects in the .NET ecosystem and also outside of the .NET ecosystem. Companies are starting to value the supply chain and they're starting to value the dependencies, what they depend upon in open source software. And Webpack, Sean Larkin, good work, Sean, has managed to get Webpack to $400,000 a year of revenue, which is amazing. It is absolutely amazing, and that is a very extreme case. But what's more typical is between what I've seen so far. So Reactive UI. So Reactive UI is just about to cross over $10,000 by the end of the year at the current trajectory, which is amazing. Thank you. Now, one thing about Open Collective is the money is not in my name. It's actually the money for all the collectives on Open Collective, open source projects. It goes to a 501c6 non-profit charity. This is really, really important because of taxation and also for succession. So if I incur an expense for Reactive UI, i.e. sending backer rewards like stickers, etc., I would raise a invoice to the non-profit open source charity, and that will go for the checks and balances of accounting. And if something's off-put, it won't get approved. The money is never in the name of the maintainers. So that means if the maintainer moves on from the project, then a new maintainer can come in. The funds belong to the project. This is one of the reasons I love Open Collective so much. So a question that's been coming up is, what do we plan to use any revenue for Reactive UI? And the short answer, the TLDR, is we'll use revenue to enable people who help the project. And that specifically, we've identified that we need to work on our documentation, we need to work on a better website design. And so instead of asking a copywriter or a website designer or UX designer to do work for free, because we also do it for free, that just doesn't work. The funds get allocated to essentially buying services. Because we have revenue, we can actually buy services, and that's from professionals, and that's like really good. So people can donate their time for helping maintain the project, but like, it would be really nice to actually have a copywriter, like a professional copywriter, making sure the voice and tone for the entire project is consistent. If the revenue is at a high enough level, maybe one day we could pay open source maintainers to maintain software, but we're not at that level yet, so we can't. So in the meantime, funds are used to improve the developer accessibility of Reactive UI. And we opened up a GitHub issue 9 days ago, and it's a request for comments. So that's Reactive UI/RFC. What's the plan with the monies? And we want your feedback. If you have ideas on how the funds should be allocated, or any process or transparency that you would prefer, please comment in there. Thank you. So I'm making no assumptions. So Shifty's asked the question, does the audience not being familiar with open source help at all, or are you spending time to bridge the gap? The answer is spending time to bridge the gap. Bring people up to speed of Nadia Abigail's work, and point them towards the Roads and Bridges report, ultimately is one of the goals. No, I haven't yet. I should probably put it in now. Alright, so those who have tuned in, thank you for joining. My name's Jeff. We're building a conference talk. It's probably attendee account. It's going to be between 50, maybe up to 100 people, if we're lucky. And it's about the sustainability of open source. And the target audience is the business. And we're essentially bridging the gap of articulating there is a problem with how business is approaching open source software. And there's been some research. A lot of people don't believe it's a problem, or they go, of course it's a problem, but they don't have any data to prove it. So there is a lady called Nadia Abigail, and she's been doing a lot of work in research. And one of the things that she commissioned is this report, and this is by the Ford Foundation. And it highlights that open source software is essentially highways. Like a local council. Someone at a local council, we pay council rates, and the council then pays someone to maintain the roads, which means there's no potholes. But the problem is companies are using open source software as their foundation for the roads, and there's no taxes paid. Now, this is important to note that they don't have to pay taxes. It's perfectly fine. The license says it's open source software to use as you so desire. That's totally fine to consume. But there is a cost of consumption, and it was best articulated a couple of years back when we had the Heartbleed exploit that happened. And here's someone that has billions of economic value, and the impact and the damage for that person not being supported was measured in the hundreds of millions. So it's one of the findings in here. It's a really good report. It's someone that a business executive could take this away and read. And that's one of the areas of success I really hope that that a business owner or an executive or engineering leader will discover Nadia's work through the talk and specifically read this report. And that's the link to the report. That's the Roads and Bridges report. Amazing read. You should read it. Hey Maggie, thanks for joining in. I don't use Markdown for my presentation software. The reason I'm using Markdown is it provides a low fidelity where I can just work on the messaging and the copy and the tone and the voice. That is much more important than the visual aspect of it. The visual aspect typically just clicks together afterwards once you figured out the messaging. So previously, Brendan was pushing me to be specific and clear. Thanks, Brendan. What is the takeaways of this presentation? Once you identify what the takeaways is, they become a repeating monologue within the actual talk. And when you wrap, there should be no surprises at the end because it's just been the same messages repeating all the way through. So that the talk is for 45, 60 minutes. It's a full conference talk. And for presenting, I would normally just use PowerPoint, but it really doesn't matter. I've experimented a lot with using LaTeX and for generating slides using Beamer. I think that's really cool. But because there's going to be a talk with two people, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to do it really simple. There's some really good Markdown presentation software out there that converts Markdown into Reveal, which is great. But I'm just going to keep it really simple. So one of the things that I'm going to incorporate in the talk, I think probably for guidance, is a lot of people don't know about the to-do group. The to-do group is a group of companies that came together to generate best practices in open source. Like things like I want to open source intellectual property within my company, make it, bring into the open. As soon as you make open source software out into the open, the job's that's just the beginning of the journey. You actually have to maintain it. And what is the best guidelines for maintaining a community? What is a successful way to run a project like that? What funding do you need? What are the governance? To-do group is an excellent resource for enterprises to look upon. So if you want to make that change within your company, I recommend looking at the to-do group and the Roads and Bridges report that I was linked previously in chat. Also, up in the chat, there is a link to the pad that I've got open. This streamer specifically is write a paper with me. So, write a conference talk with me. And if you see spelling mistakes or if you have ideas you want to contribute, jump in there and we'll do it together. Likewise, any questions, just ask in chat. Cheers.
There's a groove that I can follow that's exactly right for me to live in an optimal way. just wanna get down with you. For the last time, I can call you mine. Once more, then I swear we are through. We should still have fun, though we say we're done. 'Cause I just wanna get down with you. For the last time, I can call you mine. Once more, then I swear we are through. We should still have fun, though we say we're done. 'Cause I just wanna get down with you. For the last time, I can call you mine. Once more, then I swear we are through. We should still have fun, though we say we're done. 'Cause I just wanna get down with you. For the last time, I can call you mine. Once more, then I swear we are through.
Hey, greetings. Thanks for joining me here early this morning. I'm going to be wrapping this up probably in the next 15-20 minutes. It's getting very late. It's really cool to see all these people from PST jumping in, and now it's 8 AM for you. That's cool. Thank you very much. I've put the baseline for the talk in this pad, so if you want to jump in and help edit, that's sweet. If you go to the bottom of the document, it has information specifically about what the outcomes are. At the top of the document has who the audience is and some of the goals. So if you want to help edit it towards those outcomes, that's like sweet. This is just the essentially a scratch pad of ideas. This will be converted into a PowerPoint deck in the next couple of days. Now I'm going to quickly switch over to a talk that was done by a keynote talk that was done in the Python conference. Those who have followed me on Twitter, you're probably already familiar with this talk. It is a brilliant talk, but I'm just going to play it once on stream, and then I'm going to just keep on going backwards and forwards on it on mute. So I'll link in the talk after I play it. That way you can share it. It's a beautiful talk, and it makes some key points that are pretty amazing, but it's always weird to embed a talk in a talk, so I probably won't be embedding it into the actual presentation, but we'll be citing it. So I'm just going to roll this video. I hope you find this interesting.
But before I give myself a sprain from patting us on the back quite so vigorously, don't get me wrong, there is still a long way to go. If you compare where we are today to where we were 10 or 15 years ago, we've made some great strides. I'd like to draw some attention, though, to two closely related areas that I think we need to pay a lot closer attention to. The first is the spectre of burnout in our community. I started this talk, Richard started this morning, talking about the fact that the bulk of work on Python and Django were the result of volunteer efforts. I've almost lost count of the number of talented developers around me who have burned out or come dangerously close under the load that's been imposed by this volunteer effort. I've made no secret that I myself went through a major depressive episode last year, brought on in part by the load imposed by volunteering. I'm a lot better now, but I've still got a long way to go. This isn't a problem with an easy solution. It isn't as simple as just telling someone they don't have to volunteer anymore. Because if they're the maintainer of an even moderately successful project, I guarantee you their inbox is filled with, "Why haven't you fixed my bug emails?" Sometimes from people who should know a lot better. The greatest shocks in society occur when something we assume is plentiful and ubiquitous disappear. Petrol, electricity, clean water. If your open source project isn't planning for the day when your biggest contributor steps down or is unable to continue, your project has a clock on it. As a community, we need to institutionalize the minimization of the expectation of free labor. If you've got a project role that is going to take resources, be it material, labor, emotional energy, don't assume those resources will be available forever in boundless quantities. And if you're a free consumer of those resources, be aware of what you're consuming. If you're a commercial organization that depends on a product, and you aren't taking steps to contribute to the projects you use, I would argue you're being criminally negligent to your investors because you haven't secured your supply chain. You haven't mitigated a key risk associated with your technology stack. But it's not just about pointing fingers at bad projects or bad users or bad companies. As a community, we haven't established the conditions where companies are readily able to mitigate those risks. The free software community has spent a lot of time and effort discussing the importance of user freedoms. However, they've been almost silent on the unintended consequences of that position. When software is free as in freedom, it is almost certainly free as in beer as well, which means the task of making an income off of that software is much higher. I don't want to undersell for a moment the importance of user freedom, but to focus on user freedom to the detriment of the mental and physical health of the developers of that software is, in my opinion, incredibly negligent. How to make money from free software is a question that, unfortunately, doesn't have any good answers at the moment. As a community, we need to have a very serious discussion about the economic consequences of our decisions and how to harness the not insignificant resources that the software community has at its disposal. The good news is that there's a possibly unexpected benefit to facing this problem head on. Finding a way to pay for the resources we're consuming certainly helps to stave off burnout. But it has the added benefit that it broadens the list of people who can do the work. Volunteers, by definition, are made up by those who have the time to volunteer. If you've got a family, or you've got children, or you've got a loved one who needs care, those commitments take priority, as well they should, and they limit your ability to volunteer. You want to address diversity? Make sure that you're not just taking from the pool of people who have copious free time, which, broadly speaking, means white, middle to upper class Anglo-Saxon men aged 16 to 30. If you're someone who uses open source, don't just take. Give back in tangible ways, either with hard commitments of time or with cash that organisations like the Python Software Foundation or the Django Software Foundation can use. And this is incredibly important if you are a large organisation with extraordinary resources at your disposal who derive immense benefit from open source and volunteered projects.
So that was Russell. That was a keynote from last year at Python, the PyCon AU, and that was an intense 4 minutes. And I was going around speaking with other open source maintainers. When they see that, they go, "It me," like that hits home hard with them, and it's fantastic that he shared that with everyone and his highs and lows. It's been really, really therapeutic for a lot of people just to have that shared experience. So Russell, thank you. And he makes some really good points, specifically about securing your supply chain. So Mike Quaid from the Homebrew project makes the argument that the open source maintainer is the customer. All right, when you're asking, so you are, let me just get it up to it. Yeah, as a user of open source software made by a maintainer, you are not my customer. It's actually around the other way. You should try and motivate me to spend time on you, because I could spend time on family, my own personal projects, or watching Netflix. All is fine. Remember, the software is open source. So I think that we can weave a very cool story with Mike and also Russell, specifically around that maintainers are vendors, and then companies should secure their supply chain, reminding them as such that it's all as is, there's no SLA, and providing examples how companies can supplying examples how companies can secure their supply chain. And I think that's going to be really important, because Russ ended up with a fantastic point: diversity. A lot of open source projects is done by the younger generation because they have time. And I've had to dial back the amount of open source work I've done because of being a father. But the problem with this perspective and what's wrong is the younger generation keeps making the same mistakes. They keep burning out, like same things, and there's no real seniors available to coach and mentor them because they've had to reduce the amount of time in open source. So this problem is going to keep happening until we work on solving it. So that's kind of the point of this talk, is to it's a conversation with the business. Anyway, I'm really chuffed to see 7 people currently on the stream right now. That's amazing. That's just on Twitch. For those watching at Twitter, awesome. I'm going to wrap up now because it's getting quite late. If you want notifications when I'm next on air, just go to ghuntley.com/live and follow me on Twitter, Twitch, and there's a calendar you can subscribe to. Before I wrap up, 10, 15 minutes. If you've got any questions about open source, maintaining, community, anything, up for grabs. All right. Until then, I'm just going to keep working on this. Hey, Michael. Thanks for the question. All right, so automated privacy screen switcher. There's a couple of things I've got. If you're using OBS, it's built into the software. You can configure a regex option to switch between scenes. It's like the top right-hand most menu, and let me just pull it up so I've got some screenshots. But you configure a regex based off the window title, and it'll switch between scenes, and that provides a level of privacy. I'm using different software to OBS, so I've got something I've got something that will switch the scenes based on the same logic. For now, I don't have it completely implemented yet, so I'm doing it manually. And one of the reasons I have a physical control pad is so I can do it manually. One tick. All right, so this might be a little bit hard to see, but this is my physical control pad. And you might notice in the center there's a quad key. It's really huge, it's really big. And if I press this button, it switches to the privacy scene. So it's a dedicated, very large button, easy to discover. And when it's enabled, it actually starts flashing. And that grabs my attention and reminds me that I've got it enabled. What I can see from my perspective, let me take a screenshot. Yeah, it'd be really cool. It's really cool that you're considering streaming and also doing live coding. Um, got any ideas in particular about projects or formats you're going to be working on? It's something I've been thinking about quite a lot, and I haven't found a particular format. So today is the first time experimenting. Like, let's write a conference talk together. Hello. Thanks, man. A lot of people want to get into public speaking and doing conferences, and I'm still quite new as a public speaker on a large 100-ish scale, and getting better. And I just want to make it show people behind the scenes how I write a talk, and people have better ideas how the talk should be structured or the process. I'm all ears. Oh, cheers, man. If you want the real big fish, go check out Noopcat, Susan Hinton. Go read this. Very, very good article. And lots of lessons learned, and it gives you some insights of how you should set up your software as well between the different scenes, like privacy scene, etc. I broadcast under a different Windows account. There's a whole bunch of things I do, um, and there's some projects I just don't do on air because I can't, and it's not a good idea. All right, so that screenshot's uploaded. I'll dump it back in as soon as it finishes. Hey, I'm fine to talk about open source and going off on a tangent. My first open source thing on GitHub, I did a pull request to Zach Holman, was one of the early like first 10 GitHub employees, and it was just a Bash file, like a pull request to add in to his Bash configuration because I cloned his dot files. Let me see if I can pull it up. Yeah, so this is my first one on GitHub. This is the first time I did a pull request. Quite a while ago now. In 2010, he did this blog post saying that he's open sourced his dot files. Dot files are configuration files for Linux and Unix, and I used his as a baseline for my own. And I wanted to add something to it, and I figured that he would like what I've added. So I submitted a pull request in, and Zach merged it. Thanks, Zach. He was my first pull request on GitHub. First open source contribution. First open source contribution, probably like early 2004, maybe even earlier. I was doing some stuff with SysLinux. It used to be it's a bootloader for Linux, and I did some patches so I could do a network boot. After that, I did a whole bunch of stuff in FreeBSD, but I stuffed it up royally. Like one of my first contributions to the FreeBSD project is I sent in a reverse patch, which basically undoes the work that I did. So I submitted a negative patch. These are all mistakes you'll do when you get in open source, but you forget about them over time. So my recommendations is look at what's in your package JSON or your packages config. Figure out which open source project exists that you use, learn that project, and just like start a communication with the maintainer. And just say, look, I want to help. Those simple words, I would like to help you. A lot of people don't just use those words, and as soon as a maintainer hears someone, I want to help you, like it opens doors. Like I was down in Melbourne recently, and I was having some beers with a acquaintance, and in particular, like they knocked off early. It's like, so we're having beers. It's knocked off early. It's like, why are you going home? Because like I'm so excited. I've got a whole bunch of like third party contributors, and I want to make sure they have a good experience contributing in open source. So they've actually stepped up and said, "How can I help you?" So they're like, we're all mates, but we cancelled beers and went home, and he did his open source stuff, which is like great because you can do corporate open source stuff, but getting someone external from the community and giving them a good experience and them wanting to help you out, it's like the best feeling. Cheers, Michael. Thanks for dropping in. All right, thank you very much for tuning in. Done a whole bunch of work. I'm just going to call it a wraps. We've got the structure of the talk sorted out, some of the content. We defined what success is, which is really cool. I'm going to take this tomorrow, and with my speaking partner, we'll go through and just flesh this out, and then the next couple of days we'll turn it into a talk. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is normally I do pair programming. This time I was playing around with the idea of let's just build a conference talk. It's a little bit different. Experimenting with different formats to figure out what works on Twitch. There's a whole bunch of different ideas I've got. I'd be interested to hear people's feedback. If you want to know more about that, hit like on YouTube, subscribe on Twitch, and go to the calendar, and then you'll see when I'm next on air. Anyway, quite late. Thank you very much for tuning in. Cheers. Bye.